Welcome back, my fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone who is new to this channel or to my podcast. This podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be graphic and violent content, so listener discretion is advised. Welcome to episode 22, guys. We're heading back to the South, or at least we're going to be talking about a state in the South, and not to mention one of the greatest states of all time. I will say, though, the time that we are talking about, according to articles and documentaries that I have watched, there were multiple serial killers in the area at the time, which is really quite truly terrifying, if you ask me, and especially being a woman myself, and in this day and age, how scary a time it truly would have been, just considering multiple serial killers. So our state is Louisiana. I love everything and adore absolutely everything about New Orleans. In my eyes, it's just gorgeous. It's just beautiful, not to mention the history. And given my Spanish background, it does speak to me slightly, I guess. And a fun fact for my listeners today and my viewers, for a period of time, the French actually would give up Louisiana to the Spanish for their assistance during the 7-Year War. So the architecture in the French Quarter is actually Spanish. So that's kind of cool, in my opinion. I thought I would share that one, and I hope you all like that fun fact. We are going to be talking predominantly, though, about Baton Rouge, not about New Orleans. Our serial killer today is Derek Todd Lee. He was also known as the Baton Rouge Strangler or serial killer. He was really one of the most appalling human beings we've ever had to read or watch about. I can and will tell you, obviously, about his less than idyllic childhood and the horrible things that he did endure. But the fact that he himself was a child when he very first attempted to murder someone, that's just really going to trigger me and truly disgust me that a child is already at that level at such a young age. I will advise once again, guys, that listener and viewer discretion is advised before I do start this podcast. If you guys want to know a little bit more about this serial killer in particular and you want to watch some documentaries, he's on a TV series called Marks of a Serial Killer, World's Most Evil Serial Killers, and it's called Capital Baton Rouge. Enjoy it if you watch them. Right, we're going to start at the beginning like we always do. We're in for a bumpy ride, guys. Now, his story would begin on November 5th, 1968 in St. Francisville, Louisiana. His parents were Samuel and Samuel Ruth or Roth. There's some misconstruing information, and his mum's was Florence Lee. So his father was actually not on his birth certificate. So I imagine that that's the reason why his last name is Lee. I am purely speculating here that he took the last name of his mum. The articles, though, that I've read about Derek's father in particular, he suffered from mental illness. Some say schizophrenia, some say bipolar. Whatever the case might be, it really did end quite badly for Samuel because he would be arrested for attempting to kill his second partner. It does say wife in some, but he wasn't married to Derek's mum, according to most of the articles that I've read. Ultimately, though, it wasn't Samuel that would raise Derek. It would actually be a gentleman by the name of Coleman Barrow. That's who Florence would end up marrying, and that's who would become his stepfather. This is not a man you would pick at all to raise your children. His mum, though, wasn't really any better. In a world with parents like this, it doesn't really surprise me that Derek has turned out a little bit the way he did. Though, to be fair, I'm actually not sure that some part of Derek wasn't born with some severe issues themselves. Florence and Coleman were particularly religious and would raise their children in a fairly strict religious Christian home. Beating seemed to be the way that they would discipline their children. They would say that certain articles would say that Derek got it a lot worse than his siblings. I'm never really going to understand why parents or anybody feel the need to beat anybody. Children especially, though. Especially during those formative years where they're forming those bonds. His mum didn't so much beat him, she watched and she allowed it, was what I've been able to justify. What I've been able to read up on, that she didn't necessarily participate in but she was a co-conspirator in the fact that she just kind of did nothing as a result. Now, to add more to a really shattered little boy, he'd have a really, really tough time in school. It was during this time that it would become known that Derek was developmentally challenged. He would need to attend some special ed classes. His fellow students would tend to bully him and mock him for this. And not only did they do this, but they'd ridicule him for sucking his thumb and calling his teacher mama. Now, given his home life, I'm not shocked to hear that he sought comfort in a teacher, and it was probably the first time that he felt that an adult had shown him kindness. So I imagine that's what he expected a mum would behave like, and maybe that's why. Again, purely speculating, guys. It was during this time that a young boy with a lot of pent-up anger, it would start to direct outwards, certainly, and it really has some grisly consequences. Before he was even a teenager, he would torture his own dog and her puppies. Cruelty to animals is one of the McDonald's triads. And this is what sometimes these particular triads lead to: psychopaths, sociopaths, and sometimes serial killers. Whilst it doesn't always happen, these traits in particular can be common for a lot of serial killers' behaviours, like before they're about to become as such. So, like other serial killers and serial rapists, he would also begin to peeping to his neighbours' windows, and this was all just at the tender age of 11. So he would quickly learn to use his charm to learn to talk his way out of trouble. This is where we start to see that sort of charisma that we've seen in other serial killers in other podcasts. Though one thing that did become really common in his behaviour, and especially particular in his behaviour, he wouldn't take any responsibility or any accountability for his own actions. It was also during this time that he would experience many injuries, none known to happen to his head, but I suspect a lot of these injuries or occurrences came from home, and probably more specifically from his stepfather. It was certainly generally noticed that there was something going on. At the age of 13, his behaviour started escalating a little bit more. He would be arrested for the first time. This time it would be for burglary and vandalism to a candy store. In the same year, when a female neighbour would confront him about him looking in on her, he would end up beating her up. 3 years later, he would be arrested and charged with an attempted second-degree murder. This is what I was talking about before, guys. So he's not even, he's 16 at this stage. He'd pull a knife out during a fight with a boy around his age. He's already known to the police at this stage for just some of his illegal activities. So he's already pretty well known in the neighbourhood for doing these things. But things didn't seem to be getting any better in school either. He would end up dropping out of school in 11th grade. This was predominantly due to his bullying and some of his escalating deviant behaviours. So I'm guessing that some of those behaviours that we're seeing with about the peeping sort of came out in school as well. So around this time, he would also set his car on fire for insurance purposes, so he could collect the insurance money. With all these criminal acts he's doing over the past 5 or 6 years, I'm surprised to say that he wouldn't spend any time in a juvenile detention centre or even jail. He was able to talk his way out of all these instances, which is pretty impressive if you're asking me. Between the ages of 16 and 13, he was arrested for a number of different crimes, but nothing seems to, again, have led to any jail time. Just probation and a lot of people and a lot of the court system saying, hey, requires therapy. When it was mandated, he often wouldn't attend, though. So he'd also get married at this time to a Jacqueline Sims, even though their marriage involved a lot of violence, affairs, and just in general extremely dysfunctional. She would still be married to him at the time of his arrest. But everything changes in 1992 for Derek. Now, again, guys, we're going to be talking about known victims. It's not necessarily the ones he was convicted of or anything like that, but it's definitely the ones that he's known for. In fact, police do suspect more, but given at the time of his murders, there were 3 active serial killers. DNA may be the only way to identify or correlate him to any of those murders. I am so sorry. My kitty cats are being so naughty at the moment. They're really, really going. So whilst it's never been confirmed, it is believed that Connie Warner is his first known victim. She lived in the Oak Shadow subdivision in Zachary, Louisiana, at an area which at the time that he and his wife were living. Connie would disappear from her home in late August 1992. The police would end up being called by her daughter when she failed to get in touch with her mum, and she would become quite worried. Now, the police go and search Connie's home, and they're discovering signs of an attack, including bloodstains. Her car was parked outside, but her keys were nowhere to be found. So they would end up suspecting that the killer had used the car to remove Connie from her home, whether it be her body, but they suspected this. Her body would be found 11 days later after her disappearance. Now, this was near the state capitol building. She'd be found in a ditch near the lake near there. Before the Zachary Police Department could really investigate, though, Hurricane Andrew had hit at the same time. So it's washed away all of that evidence that was surrounding the body and anything tying those murders. So Derek was definitely on the radar, but unfortunately they would have nothing tying him to that murder at this stage. During the time before his next murder, though, he didn't stop committing crimes. It just involved peeping, stalking, and an incident involving a couple in which the woman would actually identify him a couple of years later as the person who had attacked them. It's also noted, though, before the next murder, he's arrested multiple times. He does spend time in prison. He'd even have court-appointed therapy, which he failed to attend. And he did attend 1 or 2 times, but it didn't do any good because none of these incidences or time in jail would actually help any of his mental state. And he'd murder again in 1998. So in April 1998, a Zachary police detective by the name of David McDavid, he's playing softball in a tournament, and he's got a call about a disappearance and a likely murder of a lady by the name of Randy Mebruer, Mebruer, Mebruer. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Now, he's just one of 3 detectives in this small police department. So he arrives at the scene, or he arrives at her home, and learns that Randy had been snatched from her home while her 3-year-old Michael slept just down the hall. That's truly a gutsy move, right? You've got a child in the home. But inside this house in particular, the police would find the hallway had been streaked with blood. Someone had clearly attacked Randy in her bedroom, and then they dragged her down the hall and into the kitchen. On the floor of the hallway, they would find one of Randy's contact lenses. Now, they're side by side and they're just inches apart. So she's hit hard enough face down to knock her contacts out. That's a pretty significant blow to your head. There is a Sergeant Day that is investigated. He's a patrol officer at the time, and he would assist at the time in the crime scene investigation. So drops of blood have been splattered from the kitchen to the carport. It was likely at that time that she was picked up and she's placed inside that carport. But it appears as though any indications of her, they all end in that carport. So they would find, though, fresh flowers that had been stuffed inside a garbage can, and a pink trash bag was lined in that can. This is important because they're going to find a roll of pink plastic garbage bags. Now, it's still, and stuck on the outside of that roll is a drop of blood and a trace of semen. So he's obviously used that to clean up a little bit. Randy's house was also in the subdivision of the Oak Shadows. So this house is within walking distance of where Connie Warner was attacked. So detectives assumed pretty quickly that those 2 murders would appear to be connected. Now, the detective McDavid, he would even go as far to say, it's going to be Derek Todd Lee. So he's already massively on their radar, right? He is right there. So he's clearly a suspect. But shortly after this murder, he actually beat his girlfriend up. He beat his girlfriend up. He was having an affair at the time. I think her name was Cassandra. Now, he'd be sent to prison for 9 months for beating his girlfriend in a bar and attempting to run over a deputy while trying to avoid arrest. But he's going to get out of jail in January 2001. So in September 2001, the bodies are going to start piling up about 15 miles away from Baton Rouge, and the count's about to get a little bit higher. So this is where the media are about to start dubbing some names. But one of the first known victims to die at the hands of the Baton Rouge serial killer was a 41-year-old by the name of Gina Green. Now, Gina, who was just 41 at the time, she lived just off. So she's on Stanford Avenue, which is just near Louisiana State University's campus. She's a nurse and she's specializing in infusion therapy. She drove a BMW convertible and she was absolutely adored by her nieces. In September 2001, police find her strangled body inside her home. An autopsy would report that she died from asphyxiation due to strangulation at about 9 a.m. that morning. Evidence definitely suggested that she had been sexually assaulted. Police discovered that several items had been stolen from her home. That would be her purse. It would also be her mobile phone. The purse was never found, but the phone was later recovered across town in an alley. About 3 or so months later, Derek's next known victim was across the Mississippi River from downtown Baton Rouge. She's 21-year-old Geraldine DeSoto. She lived in a mobile home just off a highway in Louisiana, and she was about to start school where she had hoped to become an occupational therapist. She had a job interview in January, but unfortunately she would never make it. And what we do know about Geraldine's mobile home is that someone broke into it and the intruder would smack her in the head with a telephone and they would stab her 3 times. She was really, really tough though, and she fought really, really hard. She would run to her bedroom and she would manage to get her hands on a shotgun. Now, it looks like when she tried to turn the gun on her attacker, he managed to jerk it out of her hands. Now, he would end up cutting her throat from ear to ear and stomp on her body. Now, just remember, guys, this is a change in MO, right? Because previously it's been strangulation. So he was obviously really mad at her for fighting back. So I think we're starting to see that escalation for sure. Our next known victim was 22-year-old LSU graduate by the name of Charlotte Pace. Her body would be found in her townhouse on Charlotte Avenue in Baton Rouge. Her roommate discovered her body on May 31st, 2002. She would be stabbed to death as well. Now, evidence would show that she put up a huge fight as well because she would die, even though she would die because of these injuries. She had scratch marks and she had him underneath her nails. It's also shown that she possibly hurt her attacker, like in Gina's case, though, she was also found to be sexually assaulted. Now, she had recently moved just before her death and lived only 2 days in the house where she would be murdered. Her previous address was a couple of doors down from Gina Green. They would find no evidence, though, that the two had known each other. We're starting to see, though, a change in that MO, guys. So we're starting to see from strangulation, which is really, really personal, and it's really in your face, to stabbing. It's quite a change. Serial killers have been known to change their MO, but you are definitely seeing an escalation in Derek's violence. So this is where things get a little bit confusing for me. So if you think about the victims that have been strangled and these are the ones who've been stabbed, this will all come together a little bit later, guys. But I'm telling you, I'm not sure, even though they're saying they're known victims, I'm not sure you would change your MO that much. So several of Charlotte's items were missing as well. So the serial killer is starting to take those souvenirs. Now, according to police reports, a Louis Vuitton wallet with her keys to her BMW was stolen. The wallet would contain her driver's license as well as some of her other personal effects. A mobile phone and a silver ring would be taken. So the police did leave the killer did leave something behind, and that was fantastic for the police. He would leave a footprint. So in August 2002, a task force was formed of 40 investigators from various law enforcement agencies. This would include the FBI. This would include the Baton Rouge Police Department, the East Baton Rouge Parish's Sheriff's Department, the Louisiana State Police, the Lafayette Parish Sheriff's Office, and the Iberville Parish Sheriff's Office, among others. Now, this multi-agency homicide task force was formed to establish a clearer line of communication amongst all of those departments themselves. They believed, once again, that this could help them share information better and catch the killer much more quickly. So they're obviously learning over time that it is better to collaborate with all of the agencies than, each parish or each area just handle it on their own. But a mistake was quickly made by the task force. A meeting would be held shortly after the task force had been formed, and the Baton Rouge Police Department hosted a meeting for the local law enforcement investigators. The purpose of the meeting was to find out how many cases were linked to the person we're talking about, the Baton Rouge serial killer. So Zachary Detective David McDavid, he's attended that meeting. He presented 3 of his cases to the group: the murder of Connie Warner, the murder of Randy Marubra, and the attack on the couple that we talked about specifically before. The detective told the group of law enforcement professionals that he and an attorney in general investigator, Danny Mixon, were looking hard at a local pervert who'd been named as Derek Todd Lee. Now, unfortunately, the lead agencies and the Baton Rouge Police Department, they would end up telling McDavid to go home. The serial killer that they had and the profile they had was that he was a white male, and the FBI profile said so. And Derek Todd Lee was African American. End of story. But what a silly mistake for them to just immediately done. They would unfortunately soon realize how quickly that mistake had been made. Later, though, rather than sooner, there would be more victims to come. But before the task force was formed, I got a little ahead of myself there. There would be a survivor of one of Derek Todd Lee's. Her name is Diane Alexander. Now, Diane Alexander was at home alone in July 2002, and he would knock on her door and he would ask to use her telephone, claiming that he was lost. He then would force his way into her home, and he attempted to rape her, but he would beat her and he would choke her with a telephone cord that was inside her house. Now, he would flee her home only because her son pulled up to the home, and thankfully Diane Alexander actually lived. But after recovering from her injuries, she would help the police create a sketch of her attacker. However, more women would be murdered before he was caught. So I think this is where we're starting to see that a FBI profile was so quickly established, and witnesses would claim that there was a white man and all this kind of stuff, that at the same time there is another serial killer, I might add, that is white. I think it was actually 2, sorry. I will have to get those details, but I'll put them in the comment section. But how dismissive they were that it could have been another person is what would lead to more women dying. So I'm not saying it's an arrogant thing or anything like that. I just think that perhaps if they hadn't been so quickly to dismiss David McDavid, there might not be as many murders, right? But, hindsight's a wonderful thing. That's where we're at in life. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. But our next known victim is Pam Kinnemore. Now, she left work on a Friday evening in July 2002. A mother and a decorator and an antiques dealer, Pam owned her own business called Comforts and Joys in Denham Springs, Louisiana. When her husband would return home from work a little bit later that evening, her car was still there, but she wasn't. he would wait for her to show up and became worried with the more time that passed. It's not like her to go disappear without saying where she's going. And later that evening, he would even call the police to note her disappearance and report her missing. But the police investigators, they didn't initially suspect anything or any type of foul play. Perhaps she'd forgotten to tell her husband that she had made other plans. Maybe there was an emergency with a family member. Maybe there was just, there's some circumstances where you wouldn't contact your partner. I'm not sure that that's true, but okay, devil's advocate, it does happen. As the days passed, though, something sinister was definitely becoming more obvious. Now, it took them days to realize that. So it's, for me, I think it was definitely something they should have looked at sooner. So shortly after her disappearance, the family would post billboards with a reward of $75,000 for her safe return and any information concerning her whereabouts. But unfortunately, they were really beginning to fear the worst case scenario and prayed that she would be found alive, that their hopes would be dashed after just a short 5 days after she'd been reported missing. So a gruesome discovery would be located on a boundary line between Baton Rouge and Lafayette in a marsh area of the woods just beneath a bridge. Some people would notice a human-like figure lying at the water's edge. And as they approached, they actually discovered that it was a nude body of a woman. Now, this unfortunately would lead to be Pam Kinnemore, and she died from cuts to her neck, and that was believed to be from a knife, and she'd also been sexually assaulted. They would learn pretty quickly that Pam showed similarities to the other women that are murdered in the same general area a couple of months earlier. So we're noticing Charlotte, we're noticing Gina and Geraldine. Investigators definitely started to suspect that on the night of her disappearance, the killer found his way into that home in Baton Rouge, into Pam and her husband's home, and he would actually abduct her. Because there's no signs of forced entry, police believed that she willingly entrusted that and let the killer, as he hadn't entered through an unlocked window or door. At the time, though, her body was discovered, it appeared as if the killer had taken a souvenir from her. A plain silver toe ring that Kinnemore almost always wore had been removed from her body. Investigators believed that the ring, if found, would definitely be more evidence linking the killer to Pam. Now, about a week or so, sorry, just excuse me, I am going to take a drink. Oh. 1 week after this discovery of Pam's body, police learned some really valuable information. A woman came forward claiming that she had seen Pam in an unidentified pickup truck on the night of her disappearance. But according to this witness, who remained under police protection in fear for her life, she saw a man driving westbound on I-10 in a white pickup at about 3 a.m. She claimed there was a woman fitting the description of Pam slumped in the passenger seat, and she appeared to either be sleeping or possibly dead. The witness, though, glimpsed at a white male driver. She would notice the truck getting off at the Whiskey Bay exit, and that was close to where the remains would later be found. She immediately, though, contacted the police when she realised that there may be some connection between the man and the woman and the truck and the disappearance of Pam. Now, she would be so very wrong, and it would lead the police to go down a very, very wrong trail. It's not saying eyewitness testimony is very well known to be wrong, so that's why it's often not used in courts and stuff like that. So this is where it possibly was a bit of hysteria coming in through people. Absolutely also understandable too. So our next victim was 23-year-old female, and she's a Marine, by the way, and her name is Trenisha Colon. She disappeared in November 2002. Now, on the day that she went missing, her black 1994 Mazda MX-3 was found with the keys in it on Robbie Road in Grand Couture. She's nowhere to be found. She's nowhere in sight. 3 days later, a rabbit hunter would discover her remains several yards off the roadside in that wooded area in the St. Landry parish. Her body was found about 30 miles from her car, and she had been bludgeoned to death. Now, she had fought really, really hard as well against her attacker. The task force investigators revealed that 1 month after her death, that DNA evidence linked Tranisha, Charlotte Pace, Gina Green, and Pam Kinnemore murders. Now, according to an article that I read, she was the Baton Rouge's serial killer's first known African-American victim and the first one to be found outside Baton Rouge. Derek would also take another souvenir, a ring with love on it. That's something she had recently purchased. Now, in March 2003, the last known victim of Derek Todd Lee was a Kerry Lynn Yoder. She's a 26-year-old doctoral student at LSU. Now, she'd go missing from her home as well. She would live only a couple of miles from Gina Green and Charlotte Pace. Like Tranisha, she actually lived alone, but her boyfriend of 3 years, Lee Stanton, he would report her missing after a few days of not hearing from her. He became very concerned, though, and he would end up contacting the police. Her boyfriend would say that the last time he talked to her, she said she was going to the Winn-Dixie grocery store on Burbank Drive. Now, they had made plans to talk that night or the following day, but when he hadn't heard from her, he really did start to begin to worry. The next day, he would go and check on her and notice that her car was there and the lights were on in the house, but he actually didn't enter the home. I suspect, though, like, boyfriend of 3 years, I probably would have knocked on the door. I probably would have done a little bit more, but at the same time, I'm guessing, like, it was, oh yeah, she's home, maybe she's mad at me, maybe I've done something wrong. But after he still hadn't heard from her, right, he decided to return to her house and look inside. He noticed, though, that her phone, her keys, her purse were on the counter, but the back door was open. It was then that he began to realize that something might have gone terribly wrong. He immediately called the police upon seeing all of this. So I'm not sure if I would have let it slide that many days, but it's certainly concerning to me that you took a little bit too long. But it would state in one of the articles that I read that everything in the house appeared normal except for a wall-mounted key holder by the front door, which was dangling by one screw as if it was knocked off the hinges by force. So it suggested definitely that there was some type of struggle in the home. But at this stage, the police also didn't suspect foul play. They would remove items from her home and they would analyse them at the crime lab. The items included a personal computer, her car, and the front door. They really hoped to find fingerprints or messages or fibres or any type of evidence linking to some type of disappearance. But upon further investigation, it was discovered that she had indeed returned home from the grocery store and had been home several hours before she had actually gone missing. So they quickly changed their minds on whether something had actually happened to her. So it went quickly from, oh, this isn't foul play to, oh, hang on, we might have a problem here. So they would intensely investigate her home and the surrounding area. They conducted a search using helicopters in the hopes of, like, that aerial position would make it easier to locate her. They would run investigators down to that Winn-Dixie looking for any information concerning her whereabouts, whether they'd seen anybody with her, all that kind of stuff. But unfortunately, sometime short time later, her body would be found and her family and friends would be confronted with their worst fears, because on a rainy day, a man fishing just by a river basin discovered a badly beaten body near the Whiskey Bay Bridge. Now, she was found in the water near where Pam Kinnemore's body had been found, and that had been just a short 8 months before that. So he's already got what we would call a dumping ground, I'm guessing near water and stuff like that. But according to the medical examiners, she died from strangulation, and it was determined that she had struggled with her killer before being strangled. 1 week before her death, investigators would initially say that there was no known link between her murder and the Baton Rouge serial killer. However, pretty quickly, once the DNA tests would arrive and the samples from that scene, she would be proven to be another one of his victims. So we're already sort of seeing all of this. He's left DNA behind. He's definitely got some anger management issues, we'll call them. So in April 2003, the Zachary Police Department began to receive complaints from a woman in the Oak Shadows subdivision. Someone was stalking her on her morning jogs. The police started to look around and they find boot prints outside a window. So their peeping Tom is back. So Derek Todd Lee is back in that same sort of area, and he's peeping on his neighbours. So the department began to dig a little bit further into his criminal history, and a timeline would be established that would document the dates that Derek had been in jail and compare them to the timelines of the dates of the murder of Connie Warner and the disappearance of Randy. So a comparison would also be run against the dates of the murders linked to the Baton Rouge serial killers. So the Zachary department are doing quite a thorough investigation into him. And it's found really quickly that Derek Todd Lee was out of jail during every single one of those attacks. And a DNA sample was required if they were going to link him to absolutely any of those murders. So a judge in East Valencia Parish would issue a court order to take a DNA swab from Derek Todd Lee. In early May 2003, the Zachary Police Department would start surveillance on him, and they would approach him with the court order to get his DNA. He seemed at ease, and he was really quite jovial and quite friendly with them up until he saw that court order and why they were there. However, they would still get that sample. Now, it would be sent to the State Police Crime Lab. Now, the Zachary police detectives and Attorney General investigations had to wait quite a bit of time because it was really backed up. The serial killer task force had priority over their DNA sample. Meanwhile, cops in the St. Martin Parish released a sketch of a black man that they had said had broken into a woman's house and tried to rape her. The attacker ran off when the woman's son came home and surprised him. Now, that's that Diane Alexander, right, guys? So we're already sort of seeing a pattern emerge that clearly the departments weren't all talking to each other. Detective David McDavid, he saw that sketch in the newspaper and he absolutely knew it was Derek Todd Lee. The Zachary Police Department asked the crime lab to hurry up. They wanted this expedited straight away. So during the last week of May 2003, it's confirmed by a lab technician processing the samples that there was a positive match between the suspect's DNA, Derek Todd Lee, and the samples taken from Carrie Lynn Yoder. Now, technicians were able to further link the suspect to 3 more murders in the Baton Rouge serial killer. So after many, many long months, investigators finally had their suspect, a 34-year-old man by the name of Derek Todd Lee. So on Monday, 26th, 2003, they would issue an arrest warrant for him. He had fled to Chicago and then he'd fled to Atlanta to escape these murder charges. But at the time the warrant was issued, he and his family had gone already for approximately 3 weeks before this. So police would learn on the day that he provided his DNA sample, his wife, Jacqueline, withdrew their children from their school and claiming that they were moving back or to Los Angeles. The couple then quickly packed up their home, all of their belongings, and abandoned their home. So you're already sort of seeing a pattern, right, guys? Like, he knows what's coming. He knows his DNA is going to match all of those. But it was thankfully on May 27th, 2003, that the Atlanta police, who'd been working with the FBI, would apprehend him at a hotel in which he was staying with his family. Now, he would waive extradition and he was flown back to Louisiana the following day. Sorry, guys, I'm just going to take a quick sip. Initially, he was charged with the murder of Carrie Lynn. However, in early June, he was also accused of the rape and murder of Gina Green, Charlotte Pace, Pam Kinnemore, and Trenisha Kaloum, based on DNA evidence that had linked him to all of those crimes. So following the release of his lengthy criminal history, residents of Baton Rouge were really shocked to learn that they had never suspected him in any of these murders, especially because the focus changed so quickly from it being a white man to an African American. Now, the task force was really heavily criticised because he'd been overlooked after being brought to the attention by the Zachary Police Department in 2002. And look, I think somewhat they did deserve that, right? They quickly dismissed that department as if it was nothing. But the Zachary Police Department, they suspected him in the murder of the 41-year-old of Connie Warner and the disappearance of the 23-year-old Randy in 1998. But despite the mistakes that have been made in this case, the task force was actually congratulated for their work in catching the killer. I think a lot of the congratulations belongs to the Zachary Police Department. They were really adamant on what was going on there, and they really knew that they had their man. So for me, it's much more of the commendation should be going to them, personally. So after he's been taken into police custody, the police, with the help of the FBI, would focus on trying to locate Jacqueline and the couple's two children. It was hoped that she would be able to provide some clues into his behaviour and his whereabouts during those crimes. And it was also suspected that she was hiding because, like, she was fearful, she was scared, which you can completely understand. Like, you would be, you'd be terrified. You've just found out your husband is a serial killer. So initially, they couldn't be traced at all. But eventually in June 2003, the FBI would locate them in Chicago. And they were interested in her for not only questioning purposes and seeing what it was all about, they needed her consent to actually search the property because they suspected that there might be bodies or there might be further evidence. Now, she would grant them permission almost straight away, but no bodies and no further evidence had been found. Although his DNA would link him to other murders, Derek was only convicted of 2 murders. It was Geraldine DeSoto and Charlotte Pace. So on August 5th, 2004, probably about 15 months after his arrest, he had his first trial, and that's the murder of Geraldine DeSoto. That begins in Port Allen in Louisiana, and one of the very first witnesses to be heard by 6 men and the 6 women jury would be Derek's surviving victim, Diane Alexander. Now, an article I read said that she pointed to him and said during her testimony, "While my eyes were closed, I did not forget your face." She had been beaten so severely in July 2002 that her eyes had been swollen shut. Now, for her to remember him, even though she'd been beaten so badly, very courageous woman, very, very courageous woman. But she's just one of several witnesses to testify against him on that particular day. Just 4 days after that trial, the jury would deliberate, and it took them just an hour and 40 minutes to come to a verdict. On August 8, 2004, 11 of the 12 jurors found him guilty of second-degree murder in the case of Geraldine DeSoto. 6 days later, the judge would sentence him to life in Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, without the benefit of parole, probation, or suspension of his sentence. Now, the following month, in September 2004, he would face his second murder trial. This time it was for the brutal murder of Charlotte Pace. She'd been beaten and then stabbed to death with a screwdriver in her own home in 2002. So on October 12, 2004, after deliberating for about 80 minutes, jurors returned their verdict. finding Lee guilty of first-degree murder. Now, it's during the penalty hearings that jurors listened to conflicting statements made by mental health professionals concerning his intelligence. Now, according to the Supreme Court, a mentally retarded convict with an IQ below 70 must be exempt from the death penalty. It was presented, testimony was presented, claiming that he was actually retarded as he had an IQ between 62 and 65, making it difficult for him to understand the seriousness of his crimes. However, expert witnesses for the prosecution would state that he was not mentally retarded, basing their opinions on his decision-making ability and past work experience. So 2 men who he worked with from a construction company where he worked as a pipe fitter would testify during that hearing. And according to court records in October, the men would claim that he excelled at his job and was able to read blueprints, which made it difficult to believe that he had such a low IQ. I think he had development problems and development issues, like stated very, very, very at the start, developmentally challenged. I don't think he lacked intelligence, though. He was able to murder and get away with a lot of crimes during his life. So he obviously had some type of intelligence, or was it charm? We will never really know, though, because following those arguments, the jury deliberated for about 93 minutes. For them, they'd reach a verdict, and that jury rejected all of the defense's contention that he was mentally retarded, and they would decide to sentence him to death by lethal injection. Family and friends were absolutely overjoyed, and those were the victims' families. They would feel like justice had been served. In December 2004, he was formally sentenced with death. But in addition to Charlotte Pace and Geraldine DeSoto convictions, he was indicted on a count of first-degree murder in the death of Trenisha Coloom of Lafayette. And he'd been booked on first-degree counts for the murders of Gina Green, Pam Kinnamore, Carrie Lynn Yoder, and Randy. And those are all of the Baton Rouge parish. However, in January 2005, Trenisha's family decided not to put him on trial since he'd already been convicted and sentenced to death. I don't know why he wasn't put on trial for the others. I imagine it was a very similar circumstance. They'd already realised that he'd been sentenced to death, so is there any justice in us having to relive what our family member went through? But he would spend the rest of his days on death row at a maximum security prison in Angola, but he wouldn't live long enough to actually carry out his death sentence. He died on January 21st, 2016 at the age of 47. It was later determined that he had died from heart disease. I do not know how many times I can read that serial killers died a rather painless death and didn't get any of their comeuppance. But it is quite sad for those family members, to be honest, for me. So I never get really any joy of knowing that they had died quite peacefully. Thank you all for watching episode 22. If you like this podcast, guys, though, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, go and watch my other episodes if you're a first-time viewer. I hope you have a fabulous weekend, my fellow peanuts. Thank you all. See you later.